on my own, I am such a frail creature, bound to fall and fall again. Plant me like a tree by the water, with roots that grow into the stream.
Okay, here we are again. I don't remember what week it is.
4. Well, it's episode 4, so that must be week 4.
It is episode 4. This is the Olive Tree Podcast. This is Bethany. I'm Scott. What we do here every
Besides
week
drink our coffee
is, well, that's part of it. We try to bring you into our morning coffee experience. Mm-hmm. Every morning we do a couple important things. The most important is that we take time to get our day started getting closer to God and in personal discipleship or family discipleship. That's the most important thing. And the second most important thing is that we do it over coffee. And so this is the experience that we're inviting you into, and we hope that we do an okay job of redoing that, simulating that, whatever. So the planned topic for this week is Grace Is. We were going through the Is series, Truth Is, Faith Is, and the third one was Grace Is, redefining the words, bringing them back into their original meanings, being as we discovered in ourselves. And if you take a minute to look into it and think about it, you'll realize for yourself that the English language has been, as Tozer said way back in 1950, and he was referring back 50 years before that the words we use and even some of the phrases that we use within the church had been having their meanings emptied out of them and then filled back in with something less. Mm-hmm. And we discovered that, and so when God had us start this Pursuit of Character ministry and started us teaching and writing, the very first thing that became obvious and just, was weighted on our heart that we had to do was reset some words. And so we did Truth Is, we did Faith Is, we have Grace Is, we will do Pursuit Is, as the ministry is Pursuit of Character. The 60-second preview just gives you a quick highlight of the character word and what it means to us. And then we're going to go into Pursuit Is, which we actually talk about a few of the different words that we put the language in. Mm-hmm. And this is important. It isn't something that you want to say, I don't need to sit for an hour and listen to the definition of the word. Actually, you do. Or you can go read, as I said, the posts, which will probably take you just about as long by the time you read them and study them. And actually, why not do both? But the idea is you have to understand the language to have the conversation. And if your dictionary is in a different language, you can't do that, and your dictionary is. So that's why we do this. So go for it.
Well, I think what really helps you realize that you need to do this is if you try to explain some of these words, which we know are foundational to the faith as we call it, it's really difficult. Or we found, like with hope, we talk about hope in all of our events. And, the Hope series, it's really beginning with that word. And when we think about how we use it, we realize maybe how we use it doesn't make us realize we don't know what it actually means. But words like faith and grace, I really struggled to know how to define them. I had a sense of what they meant based on how they were used in the church and in my experience. But I was amazed how, even though what I knew wasn't necessarily wrong, it was incomplete. And the incompleteness of it meant that I wasn't experiencing the true gifts that God had to offer in them. And so I was thinking about that this morning when I was walking out to feed the chickens. My concept of grace before was, based on how it was used, is that it's this kind of warm blanket that's placed over our sins. That God covers our sins with this wonderful thing called grace.
So we have to interrupt this regularly scheduled programming for an important message. You'll see how she's like, what?
No.
That's how it happens. As a matter of fact, it happened, I think, 2 or 3 times this week during our morning coffee. As the idea is this discipleship and this application of the things we talk about here, that can happen. A recent activity, I guess, it was talked about what devotion is. And there was an encouragement to spend a couple minutes a morning of God's time. My computer's going back out again. Of God's time. Well, actually, it was communicated of your time at least a few times a week. So I want to show you, and this is not to brag, this is to try and illustrate something to you, how our morning, and I don't use the word devotion. I think it's a kind of a religious term, just like the other stuff we talked about. It isn't that it's bad, it's that what it's become is less than
what it's come to mean isn't what it's supposed to mean.
Right, it's less than what it's supposed to mean. It's become just a religious word. And so right now, in our morning discussions, we're looking at Charles Spurgeon, Counsel for Christian Workers. We're looking at Sermons, Volume 1 by G. Campbell Morgan.
That's
which
a good
means
one.
we read
Highly recommend.
Through. Yep. And discuss. There's always going to be a Tozer somewhere on hand. These are kind of short ones. We're not quite done yet, so let's, unless we read one of the other books, but these are ones that come from his editorials. So this is This World, Playground or Battleground. And this one we're doing a little together, and Bethany's been doing on her own for her nightly devotions. And it's Studies in the Prophecy of Jeremiah, also by G. Campbell Morgan.
Also very good.
So that's just an example of our morning devotions. And so before I get into that further, the important message. We wanted to talk about, well, we're going to talk about not grace is to this week. But I do encourage you, we always play at least a clip of one of Bethany's music videos at the end of our podcast. And so at the end of this one, we will put a clip from Grace, which is one of her songs. I encourage you to not only check it out, but listen. And that will kind of help set you up for our Grace is discussion next week. This week, we're going to talk about Protestant Purgatory. And just in case you're over there saying, well, I'm Pentecostal Purgatory, you can put whatever you want in there. Methodist Purgatory, Baptist Purgatory. You all have it. You all point at other religions that talk about purgatory. We got to be careful getting a little bit too self-centered about our own religion, as all of religion and denominations and everything, as we said, have emptied their language of God's intent and God's meaning and put in their own. And so things that we may look at today and look down on may have actually been fairly accurate when they started. And so I wanted to read to you from our favorite sermon, which is on the website. If you go to pursuitofcharacter.org and you go to Lessons from the Past, you will, right at the top, you'll see the Improved Life sermon given by Reverend David McClure in 1799, New Year's 1799. And this is just a section of that sermon. Well worth, we've read it many times, studied it. It's just
beautiful,
very important. So I could have let you read it. Do you want to read it instead?
Although we daily see our fellow men falling around us, victims to death, and moldering, which means disintegrating, to dust, it is strange that we who are living are so secure and unalarmed, and that we do not consider ourselves equally exposed to the arrest of death as others. All men think all men mortal but themselves. Constant experience verifies the solemn truth that man's life is limited and his abode on earth of short duration. Our life is indeed short compared with the eternal existence on which we must speedily enter. The few days of life, with many, are full of trouble, and all experience more or less sorrow and vexation. There are a happy few who make the brevity of life and the preparation for death the interesting subjects of their daily devout meditation, and earnestly seek for grace, that they may be prepared for a speedy summons from life, and appear with acceptance before God through the mediation of the great Redeemer. One of the ancient servants of God, reflecting on the uncertainty and sorrows of life, earnestly prays, "Teach us, O Lord, so to number our days, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom." In the right estimation of our days consists that wisdom by which men are made wise for eternity. Multiplied and various are the calls which God gives to mankind by his word and providences to improve life in the preparation for death and eternal scenes. Among these, let me invite you to the solemn thoughts suggested in the exhortation given by the wisest of the sons of men. "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might." This life is a scene of labor. We have much to do, and whatever our duty dictates to be done, either of piety and devotion towards God, of goodness to men, or for our own comfort and usefulness in the world, or our eternal benefit beyond the grave, these great duties we are to do with zeal, labor, and perseverance. The reason given for the faithful and diligent improvement of life as a state of labor and probation for eternity is that no labor of ours will avail to secure salvation beyond the grave. There is no device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom after this present state of probation is ended to secure eternal happiness. This life is our only state of trial for immortality. At death, all means of grace will cease, and men will be fixed in a state of happiness or misery according to their works.
Thank you. Okay, you might have noticed in there where, if you had noticed, had been to the site at all, or checked out the books, you will have noticed, see if we can see it a little bit, our symbol here, which is our publishing arm that we started because we couldn't find either in the world or in those who profess to be Christian in those industries of books or in music that really weren't practicing a lot of the same negative things that the world was doing. So we started our own publishing arm so that God wouldn't be interfered with, and we call that Improve Life Publishing. And we chose that from what we just read, that multiple and various are the calls which God gives to mankind by his word and providences to improve life in preparation for death and eternal scenes. And the second line, the reason given for the faithful and diligent improvement of life as a state of labor and probation for eternity is that no labor of ours will avail to secure salvation beyond the grave. Mm-hmm. So Improve Life Publishing does that. It publishes the various calls that are given to pursuit of character. So it publishes worship music, it publishes the books, it publishes the tracks that we're starting, and that's why. It's to improve life. I found that this topic so important that it's actually, it may be in all three books. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's happens to be chapter 7 in Forgotten Hope, reference part of it, and chapter 7 also talks about it in Forged Hope. And I may or may not read you something out of there, but we'll see. Because the important part of the conversation is this probation and the truth. Again, needing to understand this, there's only one. And what McClure talked about here is divine truth. That in fact, there is no device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom after the present state of probation is ended. So now you're thinking, wait a minute, you just said there is purgatory, and now you just said he said there isn't. Well, that's right. Before it became understood the way it is, I believe, but either way, Scripture is clear that what he said is true. Purgatory's now.
Mm-hmm.
The chance to do it over and get it right is the reason you exist. The reason we exist.
In time and in space.
Right. The error, the fall, the getting it wrong was done by Adam. First Adam. It was the doubting of God and the separation from God that caused. And the time from then till he brings things to an end is our time of purgatory, our time of probation to change our answer from Adam's and live it out. And so at the time that this sermon was given, I want to point out the detail because it's so important. He gave this New Year's 1799
to a packed church. And, if you read it, I said it's just well worth reading. But, you just heard him say, you think you're going to live forever, even though you're watching people die around you. Who are you? So he wasn't pulling punches. The fall of 1798 was the deadliest season of yellow fever ever. For you to get the idea, and you'll see it on the site, it's there. And I think I actually put it in Fidelity to Hope as well. 0.03% of New York City died with COVID, meaning they may have had, quadruple bypass, pneumonia, and cancer, but if they died in a car accident.
Right. And if they died with COVID, then that counted as part of that stat. 5% of New York died of yellow fever just before he gave that sermon.
Mm-hmm. And there was another major, was it tuberculosis?
Tuberculosis.
Consumption.
Was cause of 25% of the deaths in England and
at the same time.
At the same time, and a good percentage of the deaths in New England. So I mean,
they literally were.
They had disease coming from every direction, and taking them out.
Yeah.
Not just making them sick or causing a complication from some other thing. They took them out. And the difference between then and a couple of years ago was David McClure said, you could be dead tomorrow, get out there and do something. Why do you think you have a week to go tell your neighbor about God?
Mm-hmm.
Your obligation to yourself, to mankind, as she referenced last week, and to God is to improve life. And no, improve life did not mean take somebody a sandwich. It meant what he just said, prepare for eternity. Have you prepared for eternity? Have you prepared your neighbor for eternity? Have you prepared mankind for eternity? Have you looked to God, as it said here, I lost where it went. Have you earnestly sought for grace, sought for your eternity? So he said, look, yeah, I know, over the last few months, we've all known plenty of people that died. And their opportunity to seek grace is gone. And our responsibility, our call in our various ways, is to go out and let them know that their probation may come to an end at any time.
Mm-hmm.
Purgatory's about over. And where are you going to be when it is? Because you aren't going to get a chance afterwards.
Right. Well, and to connect it with something that you said last week, I think, about the log and the splinter, what you just mentioned, just connecting it with that thought, that you have to make sure that you have the truth to share it with others. We have to first receive the grace of God for ourselves and the knowledge of the truth. Then we have the bread of life to bring to others, not just some perverted or distorted, man-made facsimile.
Well, right. And again, it's about an understanding. Again, you're getting as close to a morning discussion as you can get. So it's unfiltered. It's the
he
thoughts
didn't
that
tell
come
me
to
we
mind.
were talking about
I
this.
intentionally didn't tell her that we were going to switch subjects, and we don't talk about these ahead of time, specifically because we don't talk ahead of time before our morning. We read whichever sermon that we want, or maybe we read something in Scripture in our personal time the night before that we want to share, or maybe we just things are happening in life and we need, before we go into another day, we want to talk with our family and get a little bit of grounding, a little bit of connection to that foundation we talked about. So we don't even read. We discuss what's happening in our life and how God can and should affect that. So this is what happens. So she just mentioned, and we brought it up a couple times, about the bread of life, and that the bread that Christ said, how do you not get that I'm not talking about bread? I can say that to practically every church today. How do you not get that he wasn't talking about bread? And I know it's going to offend people. Look at me brokenhearted. I'm sorry, but this is not an irrelevant topic. It's not unimportant, as he said, and as we watched happen during COVID, and as we watch happen in our personal lives all the time. People die without notice, and their time of probation is over. Their time to seek grace is over. So as Pursuit of Character Ministries, we have one important thing that we call raising the church, and it's where we go out and we try to work with local churches. And to be accurate from our perspective, we go out and look for the church, which may or may not exist in the local churches.
The assembly of called out ones.
The assembly of called out ones.
Fellowship of
right.
believers.
So we go and we look, and if we can find some that at least want to put an effort forth, we're there. And we work with them, we support them. But one of the things that we consistently run across is, like I said, I can't think of a local church that this hasn't applied to, as far as they're giving out bread.
Food pantries, dinners, community dinners, and thousands of dollars.
School lunches, or summertime lunches, or whatever you want to say. And we've had conversations with many of them, and I can give you a couple examples, just quickly, to show you where we're coming from. That it isn't, they want people to starve. Well, maybe.
What was that Havner said? The prodigal son lived today.
The local church
would give him a sandwich and a cot, and he never would have gone home.
Exactly. And we're so busy keeping people from hitting bottom that we're going to have to answer for why we got in the way of them finding God as the only solution to their life. And I say that because, as I said, we've had a couple few experiences, a couple examples. Our school lunch program, where they make up and give out bag lunches outside their church, and they have 6 or 8 people lined up at the food table at the sidewalk. They have picnic tables set up where the kids and parents, if they're with them, can go eat. And so again, we're participating with them. We're doing some other things at the same time. And we are like, okay, so we gave out sandwiches. Are we going to go sit and talk with them? And they just stood there. So we went and sat and talked with them. And that was our one visit, and the man and his, I think it was actually his girlfriend's daughter, but doesn't matter, young girl that he brought for that, we had a nice conversation with him. He talked about he hadn't necessarily felt welcome in the church, not that church specifically. And we talked to him, and he actually had some knowledge about God, but his experience with those who profess to be Christians didn't match. And so we had this conversation with him, and following that, like I said, we were doing activities with them. We did a 3-day event with that church. He showed up there. Last I knew after that, he had started going there. And to my knowledge, that's they may have had others, but that was just one time offering them bread with their bread, got them to take a closer look at God and participate. There's the community dinners, and we talked to somebody about the community dinner, and they, we're saying, how can we get involved in the community? How can we join together? Can you come and do some of the ideas we have? We'll come and do some of the.
And they held that up as, this is the best example that we can give you of the churches coming together, because we talk a lot about tearing down the walls that man is building within God's church, because Jesus, when he came to tear down those walls between Jew and Gentile, and now the Christian church is just erecting all these denominational walls. And so they said, well, yeah, all the different denominations come together in our town, and they put on this dinner every same night of the week. And I said, that's great. When do you share the gospel? You're bringing people in where they can hear the word of God. How are you doing that? And they said, well, we used to have a message after the dinner, but nobody stayed, so we just stopped. And I was like, well, why not have somebody speaking while they're eating? And they said, oh, no, we could never do that. That would interfere with the fellowship, which I could go off on a tangent on that word, and I won't.
And I want to interrupt you in midstream, but keep right on going. So these are not just, some people get in the church that are just low level in the church. They're not really committed. They're just trying to do good things. They're out there doing their own thing, and they don't understand. No, these are all at the top level of these local churches.
Yeah. So they were basically completely against speaking the word of truth to people, because they were worried that if they did that, people would stop coming. And not only, so first of all, we're not giving them the truth. We're only giving them physical bread, which, as he pointed out, could be the stumbling block that prevents people from coming to Christ. And that's completely ignoring the fact that the Bible is clear about who the church is supposed to clothe and feed. And there are actually rules, which we don't need to get into, but there are actually rules for that even within the body. But those resources, God's resources, are meant to feed and clothe his people and to make sure they're truly his people. And that's why.
And so that brings us to what we're talking about. It just gives, again, an example of how religion has adopted, and we are going to get around to giving you the full-on description, social secular religion. The world's definition of what religion in Christ should look like, and that Christ was a really good social worker that we should take as an example. Mm-hmm. And again, Christ said, "Well, you don't get that I'm not talking about bread." That was the social worker he was. He had nothing more important than our probation.
Yeah, and there's only a couple of instances where it describes Jesus feeding the people. So they like to point to that. Well, Jesus fed the 5,000, he fed the 4,000. And in one of those instances, he had been teaching them for 3 days before he fed them so that they wouldn't faint on the way home. So they had it as, well, we feed them the food first, then we might give them a little message. Jesus put the priority where it belonged. And we are supposed to be, going back to the cornerstone, we're supposed to be doing everything we do modeled after and built up on that pattern. And if we are not, we are workers of iniquity. That's what Jesus said. He said, if you aren't doing the will and the work of my Father, you're a worker of iniquity. And it doesn't matter if you're casting out demons and healing the sick.
Who might jump to the other conclusion. No, we give stuff away. We funded this entire ministry ourselves. And we just give stuff away all the time. We've provided people housing in our home.
We actually really enjoy feeding people as well, so we're not against it.
I love to cook. and I'm a small eater, which means I have to cook for other people. And so we do that. We've brought people over for Thanksgiving and Easter because of her association with Michigan State University, are from countries that don't have that, and shared the experience and the discussion of Easter and Thanksgiving with them. And we do different local events, and one that last year really did kind of touch us. We have participated in this week-long event where we set up a Pursuit of Character tent, and that we actually started doing that at the time that she had the conversation about the community dinners, and it was during COVID, and it was, look, in Michigan, we just had our governor say God wasn't essential, and that the church doors should be closed. Again, whether you are revising your history or not, most church doors closed on Caesar's command. And so what we did is that's where we kind of started with the fair thing. It's like, we just want to go out and make a very loud statement that God is essential, and his people are still here.
So we need to be visible and audible. We need to be seen and heard.
Right. And so the response to that was, nah. And so, the message they sent was probably accurate. Maybe God isn't there, but he's here. And so we did those, and part of what we wanted to do is this event is run by people that at that point we didn't know. And so we went early and set up our tent days early in order to feed all the workers, because it's a wholly voluntary fair. And we said we want to feed the volunteers every day while they're setting up prior to the fair. And so we've done that since. And last year, again, we do that. We always wear our shirts, so there's no question what we're representing. And we have conversations when we can, and then we go right into the fair. We have 5 days of talking about God. So there's just no question. And so last year when we were having the meals, the leader of the fair stopped everybody before they started eating and said that he wanted to honor the fact that we found God important and pray before the meal. And that's the point. They thanked us for the food multiple times, and it was like, no. The valuable food that they got was the bread that resulted in that statement. And the hope that it grew into more. But just, that's the point. He recognized the bread, and it wasn't the buns on the sloppy joes.
And it's not like we were preaching at them, so that's the thing. It's not just that you speak with words. It's way more effective. Finney said you need both. You need the words so that people hear the gospel. But if you don't have a life that backs it up, if we aren't living with that light shining before men so that they can see the good works as Christ defines good works and glorify our Father in heaven, which is what happened. So all we did was just reflect Jesus in front of them, and they recognized that for what it was. So sometimes it's not appropriate to preach a sermon at somebody. You live, you love in front of them, and that's what leads them or prompts them to ask you about the hope that you have.
Right, and the fact that you don't want credit.
Right.
And part of what got me, there were a few different events and a few different conversations, interactions that kind of drove me into interrupting the previously scheduled programming. One of them was about recognition, and because it's one that we hold very strong. Again, it's truth, it's in Scripture. There is no parsing words and dulling it down, watering it down. And that's that if you do things for the attention of man, and that man happens to include yourself, pat on the back thing, look at me. I'm feeding the community, and we make sure everybody's aware of that. We announce it ahead of time, and we announce the number of people that we fed, and those kind of things. That Scripture says if you've gotten your reward from man, you get no reward from me. And that is, they're just, everything we say can go off into a whole discussion. But that's a jealous God. Everything we have is His. Mm-hmm. So we don't share our food, we share His. We don't share our resources. And the one that really kind of brought me into this one, and it's where I started, about trying to convince some local professors, and I don't mean professors, that they could take a few minutes of their time, at least 3-4 days a week, to have a little devotional time with God. There's a huge flaw there. First thing, if you've got the idea that you're living on your time, you've got some serious study into what we talked about, into who He is and what this is about. You don't understand that you're in purgatory. You don't understand that you're on probation. You don't understand that you could be standing, one of the things that we put in Fidelity was that you don't understand that by the time I finish this sentence, you could be standing face to face with just you and Christ. Mm-hmm. And having to explain all of these things. And yes, you will have to explain all these things, because it also says if I tell you to warn them and you don't, you'll be accountable for their blood. What do you think that means? It means, why don't you understand I'm not talking about bread? Don't go throwing bread around and not talking to people about their probation, because you don't have my providence. You don't know. Sassy agrees. Like
she really
thought
wants
that there were
outside.
cats, and they are going to interject, and she wants outside really bad because it's Michigan and we have a 60-degree day this early in the year. But you don't have my providence. You don't know that person won't drop dead before he gets a bite of that sandwich. And if you didn't talk to them, and again, it's not Bible thumping, it's not hitting them in the head with the Bible, as we keep saying all the time. It's not standing at the crossroads of the sidewalk and making sure they know how godly you are. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't you like some of this? Well, they probably wouldn't. But it is about caring enough and loving them enough to ask and discuss and get them simply to think about their eternity and their time of probation. If you can convince anybody, but we're supposed to be going out there, and it says making disciples plural. Mm-hmm. We have to convince people, and not reason them into God, as we said. You can't do that. But we have to try to convince people that in fact they are in purgatory, and that the time that they have is not their own. It's God's. And so the minute, for me, because we talk about this all the time, the minute you have to, and they do, right now the professing church spends a whole lot of time trying to convince all of their members to just take a little of their time out for God. And it's not acceptable. If you're sitting there at a morning coffee and you're trying to convince people that out of the 24 hours, and she's a biologist, so she doesn't do math, and I'm not going to try off the top of my head, but of the 24 hours, you could take a couple minutes, at least 3 or 4 days a week for God. Well, I'm sure He's just appreciative that you would sacrifice your time like that, and you would grace Him with, hey God, how you doing? What are you going to do for me today? It's God's time. You have time for God. I'll take your calendar and show you how you have time for God too. I'll wipe it completely clean and say, you know what? None of those things happen except by the grace of God. Because except for the grace of God, your probation could have already ended. Yep. And you owe Him, you owe yourself, and not in a self-centered way. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Guess what He's talking about? He's talking about you feeling and understanding how important eternity is and how probation is both short and unpredictable. And then once you figure that out for yourself, loving your neighbor enough to not worry about whether they're going to be unhappy with what you say, whether or not they're going to like you, whether or not they're going to plow your driveway because you can't. It's about you love them enough that you will tell them about their eternity. You will tell them about probation. And this brings me to where we talk about it in Forged Hope. There are many reasons for what we experience in this world. One is simply the attacks of the adversary. We have also mentioned McClure's reference to our probation. Yet another is purification and tempering, which is tied to our probation. And that's the reference from Forgotten Hope that I quoted in here. And then we went here to Tozer. Wherever and whenever truth gets itself incarnated in a man, that man is sure to become the target of every kind of opposition, from the casual barbed insult of a professed friend to the carefully prepared campaign of the avowed enemy. And it cannot be otherwise, since we are forced to entertain truth in a world dedicated to the lie. Mm-hmm. A faithful believer, one who sees, hears, and walks in truth, creates another problem. The world, in its blindness, resents their claim to sight and will go to any lengths to discredit the claim. So you don't have to like Tozer or take Tozer's word for it. Read your Bible. Mm-hmm. Because contrary to popular understanding, God did not promise you 3 cars and a house and 2.5 kids and a happy undisturbed life. He said, which cost him his initial disciples, he said that if you follow me, if you reflect me as I say I exist, plan on persecution. You will be chased, you will be taunted, you will be killed. Mm-hmm. You don't believe that? Take some time and study what happened to the apostles.
And he also promised them that they would be kicked out of the synagogues, which was their church.
Exactly. And you have to remember that.
And there will be a time when those who kill you will think that they're doing God a service.
Right, we talk about that. You know, people really liked Paul because he was super smart and he had a whole lot of information, and so he was really instructive, and the Spirit was able to use him really well. And before he was Paul, he was Saul. And as Saul, he was one of the most diligent, informed, educated Pharisees. He was the son of a Pharisee, and the son of a Pharisee's Pharisee. He did all the rituals that he was supposed to do every day. And when he chased down Christians, when he signed the death warrant for Stephen, he thought he was serving God. He thought he could see. Mm-hmm. He dedicated all of his time as Saul to the service of God, which meant persecuting Christians. And so, as I said, he thought he could see until Christ blinded him on the road and gave him sight. Mm-hmm. We're not prepared to truly let go of all. We talked about this with COVID. All the churches like to get out there on their, pedestal and explain to the world that, they'll have to come and drag me out by the heels over my dead body. Will they ever shut down my church? And they didn't even notice when Caesar said, you know what?
God isn't essential.
God isn't essential, and the flu is dangerous. Close your doors. And they all did it. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Yes, there was the random few. You can't use that for a defense. The reality of it is if all is God's, then don't start talking about how, I've given him my wife and my children and my whatever. Have you given him your alcohol? Have you given him your addiction of any kind? There's plenty of them. Or are you of the ilk that says, well, no, flesh. If you are, go read Stark's Saga on the website.
Well, and when we get around to talking about what grace actually is, we'll talk about why that is such an insult to God, why it's blasphemous.
And get this straight. Stop being the martyr for God. Well, God, I gave you some of my time. I've given you my children, my wife, my home, my whatever. No, they're all his. He's very clear about that. So don't start calculating up the time. I had a real interesting conversation years ago with a friend of mine. And she said that, she really was pushing on her husband all the time, trying to get him to give 10% to tithe. And I said, well, there's a couple things that we should talk about there if we're going to truly get biblical about it. Look for God's instruction rather than religion. And I said, number one, you need to understand that if you're only giving 10%, you're keeping 90% of what's God's for yourself. So don't get up there and talk about how generous you are. Because it's all God's, remember? You're all, oh, no, you've agreed with me, right? It's all God's. So if it's all God's and you pay 10%, you're keeping 90% for yourself. That doesn't mean it isn't okay in some cases. God does design you to have to eat, so you probably have to buy food. So we kind of need a house. We need housing if we can get it. So there are legitimate expenses in order to properly care for yourself and your family. And he designed this world for us to enjoy, and even in its fallen state, he did it so well that we can enjoy it, and he expects that. That's what we were built to do. So I talked to her and I said, so understand that. Even if you're getting to 10%, all you've done is you've settled with the fact that you're going to keep 90% without considering it. And then we had the discussion we had a little while ago. I said, but understand this. If you convince him to give 10% and he does it so that you'll leave him alone, or if you convince him that the church is monitoring the little envelope with your name on it, and he does it for that, then great. But don't think God noticed. Because you've gotten your reward. He got his reward because he got you to stop bothering him. You got your reward because you made sure your name was on the envelope, and the church knew, yep, I got my husband given that 10%. So not only did you withhold 90% for yourself, the 10% you give didn't count because you did it to get credit from man.
Well, just looking at, I was sharing this with you the other day. I've been going back through Genesis and really spent time looking at Abraham, and that's the first time that tithing is mentioned in the Bible, is when Abraham, well, he was Abram at the time. So he had rescued all the people from Sodom and Gomorrah that had been carried off, and then it says that he gave 10% to God. The high priest Melchizedek was there as kind of the go-between, but right after he did, the context of that is that Melchizedek called the God Most High, and the kings that he had just rescued said to Abram, take all the possessions. I mean, we're going to keep the people, but you can have all this as a reward for rescuing us. And Abraham said that he had sworn an oath before God Most High, the creator, the possessor of heaven and earth, that he wouldn't take a dime from them. This is my modern translation, because he was never going to allow them to say that they made him rich. Now, our modern teaching on tithing would have been, see, you gave God the 10% and he rewarded you by all this, booty from the war. See, you should take that as like it's from God. But actually, Abraham recognized the reason he was tithing was his recognition that God was the creator, the possessor of everything. And this was him just showing that he understood that. Everything I have comes from God, and I'm honoring God by giving this 10% back. And God immediately responded to that by saying, don't be afraid, I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. Because Abraham valued God and his honor and things of eternity over all the temporal blessings.
Our interrupted message for today was that, in fact, you are in purgatory. You are on probation. And that goes for all of you. Whether or not you're a believer, you're all on probation. As all probation is, it's got a time period on it. Mm-hmm. And so, as we talked about before, the books are our study notes. And so we can really have a longer discussion on this specific thing. I wanted to read to you just a quick bit of what I wrote on topic in Forgotten Hope from this study. And again, this study came from that sermon. And it was topic for quite a few coffees, quite a long time. Probation is a time given to those who violate the law to show that they regret their previous choices. Now understand, we're just talking about what probation is, what all of you have to know it is, because we're talking about in the world. Mm-hmm. We understand probation from our experience. As we said last week, things in the physical world teach us spiritual world truths. And so we all understand probation and how it works, and this is what I'm discussing. They show this regret not by words, but by actions. They actively stand against the temptation to violate them again. They actively resist the efforts of others to lure them back into violation. They actively live a life in compliance with the rules. The result of this testing and triumphing process is a purified character. In Christian terms, a return to the image of God in which we were created. However, while in this state, we will also be tested by the same forces and characters that formerly sought to divert us. Surviving or recovering from these attacks makes us strong for the next round. We are made stronger, our resolve is hardened, we are tempered. He offered us probation. He created for all the other excuses or reasons that you've been given why this exists, and I don't mean the podcast, I mean this world. It's to give you a place to serve out your probation. Again, God knew all before creation began. Christ was there before creation began. So before he created Adam and before the fall, he had Christ planned as your means of salvation. So he had the probation planned and the opportunity to succeed at your probation. So we all know that probation is when the authority, who represents the law you broke, says, okay, I'm going to give you a chance to go back out into the community and to live by the rules. And if in order to do that, you can't go hang out with the same guys that you used to rob with. You can't go live by their rules. And if you sincerely want to succeed at your probation, they don't have to tell you that. You don't do it. Mm-hmm. And so just think about all of what goes into probation. If you violate that probation, if you go back to the same life, then they say you never seriously repented. You never seriously were sorry for what you did. And so your punishment remains. So we are all in a state of probation, and the reason that he created in the first place and will recreate the heavens and the earth in the last place is to give us a period out of an untimed eternity. He took a chunk out of eternity and created time. He created a space for you to live out your probation, for you to change Adam's answer and say, no, I'm not with that guy. You know, the gang that used to rob? Nope, not with them anymore. He gave you, out of his love for you, he gave you not just time, but the world you live in. And how dare we say, well, I'm taking up my time. I'm giving of my house. I'm giving my car. I'm giving my food. Mm-hmm. So one of the very first places where you could see a real move, and as we talked about, there's a lot of spiritual going around these days that may even be accredited to God and Christ, but it's not. And that's not saying none of it is. I'm saying there's a lot of it being referenced that's not. We just need to understand that, just think about it. If just a fraction of those who profess to believe God is who he says he is and Christ is who he says he is would accept that they're on probation, acknowledge that God created probation and created time and that everything they have is his, and that they're going to live a life as if they're borrowing from God, not the other way around. You know what a movement in the visible church would be? There'd be no confusion. There'd be no New Age meditation happening.
Well, and that's really what Jesus was talking about where we store our treasures. You know, don't toil for treasure here where moth and rust can just decay it, and where the thief can rob and steal it. Store treasures in heaven. And that's not, going back to what you said earlier, and that's not giving out food to poor people so you can say, see, I'm earning some points with God. No, it's about putting God's kingdom. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. That's what the treasure is. You know, that's a whole nother conversation. What is our inheritance? It's not some kind of jewel, some rocks that we can store in a box up in heaven. No, that's not God's kind of treasure.
Right, but it does, as you tie it, it ties to what we said last week, which is why I interrupted this message between faith and grace. We understood truth and faith, and we need to understand grace. And if we don't understand truth and faith and probation, we can't understand grace. We can't. And if we don't accept the truths that we've shared with you today, you can't. And why? They're tied to what we said last week, but it was about Paul's reference. Think about it. Are you running to win the race by saying, well, God, I'm going to give you 2 minutes today? Doesn't sound like you're in the race.
Mm-hmm. And if
you have not acknowledged that it's his race that you're running.
Actually have faith, which we keep going back to. This is why he exists, is in all the books. If we had even a glimpse, if we have a glimpse of who he is, we would want to spend all of our time in his presence. And that's one of the main themes of what McClure writes, is that this life is a scene of labor. We have much to do, but none of the things we have to do compete with our ability to be in God's presence. In fact, God created, he designed all of the parts of our labor to be in fellowship with him. And work was a gift given to Adam before the fall.
Do you have to say, well, those guys got a point. I'm going to really work to be that way. If you're married, if you have a girlfriend that's really valuable to you, it could be your parent is really close to you. Pick a relationship. How successful do you think that relationship is going to be? And maybe you've already found out the hard way. If you say, you know what, hon, we'll go with the wife one just because it'll work to keep the thing flowing. You get up in the morning, you say, you know what, hon, I'm going to bless you with 2 minutes of my time today.
And if we actually made that the way we say that with prayer, it'd be, I'm going to talk to you for 2 minutes and then I'm going to ignore you the rest of the day.
Right, which that's the point. Something that we need to understand and is not taught properly. We are taught, well, we will stand against salvation by works, which we talked about last week. We do not stand with salvation evidenced, which is what we're talking about here. If you really have that relationship with your wife, then you're kind of annoyed that you have to go off to work today and be without her. Or that they're suddenly working you overtime. Or whatever it happens to be. The natural reaction to being in a relationship is to want to be in the relationship. It's to want to talk to them. It's to want to see them. It's to want to consult them. It's to want to support them. It's to want to do them. Their will and see their desires fulfilled. So if we have to convince you that you should spend a little of your time serving the relationship you claim to have with God, you need to look at it again. Mm-hmm. If you're in a relationship with your wife, and I had this discussion with a pastor who understood prayer quite a bit, but he hadn't thought about it as thoroughly, and we were, because he was teaching prayer classes at his school, at his church, and they weren't quite getting there, and he didn't know how to communicate to them. And so, I talked to him. I said, well, we've had these conversations now with you for a couple months, and quite often you'll say, well, my wife would think this, and my wife wouldn't like that, or I need to do this for my wife. And I pointed out, your wife is never separated from you. Mm-hmm. Might be in a different town, might be in a different state, but she never goes without your consideration. Everything you do, you consider how it might affect her. What she might have to say about it, how her desires would be reflected in it. And so you're never separated. Well, that's what prayer actually is supposed to be. Yes, there are dedicated times, just like there would be with your wife, where you have a direct one-on-one, face-to-face conversation. Sometimes they're intense, sometimes they're other. But and the reality of it is, when you walk away from that conversation, you don't suddenly forget they exist. You don't suddenly start doing things that you know would be against what they would desire. They are always in communication and in fellowship with you, whether they're sitting in front of you or whether they're not. And that's what your relationship with God is supposed to look like. So again, when you're reviewing how much you've taken ownership of, also take time to look at how much time, whether or not your relationship looks like that. And if it doesn't, what you're going to do about it. We recognize that, no, that's the way it is. And how can we do? You know, my wife goes off to nurse, and Bethany was going off to be a professor, and I was working on other things in the ministry, and it was like, we all really, like, we need to be able to spend some time with God in the morning. We understood that we are instructed to start our day with God, not to generously donate 2 minutes every few days, but to actually start our day with God. And we wanted that. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to get into our day without having God, as I just said in that relationship thing, without getting God's consult and without getting God's support and without being thankful. And so, like I said, we don't use the word devotion. We get up every day and we decided, you know how we're going to do that? We're going to get up earlier, an hour earlier in the morning. We're not going to say, well, let me look at the schedule. Oh, you know, you can take 5 minutes here. No, we really want this. We have to go to work. It's God's time. We're supposed to start the day with Him, so we're going to get up an hour earlier and we're going to have time with God. Mm-hmm. And so we don't refer to it as devotion. We refer to everything because, and this will be a study for ourselves, but hey, you do it before we get there. What's worship?
Mm-hmm. And going back to the church, what is the church? Because that's what it made me think of is, we do that as a family, but we long to find other believers to do that with as well. And we get excited about even the idea that there's an opportunity to truly fellowship with other believers. And by fellowship, we mean discuss the truth, discuss our faith, discuss God's kingdom and what that's all about. We don't, yes, we want to be a part of each other's daily lives, but if God is really a part of my whole life, no matter what part of my life, even taking care of my chickens, if I'm talking to you about that, then probably at some point it's going to come, oh yeah, while I was feeding my chickens, God was teaching me this, or I was writing this song. I
was going to say, go to her videos on Bethany Ray WTS is her YouTube channel, and you might find a video of somebody dressed up in winter chicken clothes, worshiping and writing a new song at the same time.
Because that's how it should be.
Right.
We delight in Him. We love Him. We prefer Him above everything else. And that's what draws us together. Our hearts are united by our love for God.
And that's where I was headed, is that, yeah, during the week, when we have all these things we do actually have to go to, we actually have to take time away from God to do these things, but they're things that God approves, and so they're not really time away from God. He says, you know, you have to care for your family. You have to do these things. So when you're doing that, are you doing that with me, or are you leaving me at home?
There's opportunities to meditate and to worship and to commune with God in so many of the tasks that we have to do.
Right, and you are to go out. Well, and again, no, it isn't going out and being a good person at work so they can just see a good person. The whole point is, so we set that early time during the week, and we have to have a cutoff in order to go do these other things that we have to do. And Sundays, and I'm bringing this up because, you know, we're at an hour here. Sundays when we do this, we don't have a cutoff time because we are honoring that day of the Sabbath, which is another discussion. But we are honoring,
just like the tithe.
Exactly. We are honoring that day of the Sabbath, and we go until we tire ourselves out. We don't stop talking because, well, we've been doing this for an hour. We've been doing this for 2 hours. We might do it for 3 hours. As long as we're just worshiping, and it isn't necessarily singing. Most of the time it's not. Worshiping is this, excuse me, this revelation, revealing to each other the relationship we have with God. What He has taught us in that relationship, how loving you as I love myself. I'm going to share what He's taught me. You know, just everything, every angle you can think about. It's about sharing the relationship I have with the other people here. Mm-hmm. That is ecclesia. That's our interrupted programming. Tell everybody you're all in purgatory. Bring it up at church next week.
Which is
See how that
better
works
than
out.
being in hell.
Exactly.
And that's the point of purgatory.
That is that it's a time to get it right. We're going to hit Graces next week. Definitely take time to think about the things we've talked about. Start looking at how much, well, we tell everybody at church on Sunday, yeah, everything's God. Start looking at how much you're keeping for yourself, quietly, secretly. Whether or not in every decision you make and in every choice about time, you're acknowledging that this is God's. I don't take it frivolously. Again, the reason for the book series was stewardship. And when he said, you've got to write a book, and it's got to be about stewardship, which is fidelity to hope. And when I started to study for that, it became, I don't see any of those foundation stones today that are necessary. You can't be a good steward of something you don't have or understand. And so it became forgotten hope. What is hope? I'll let you know ahead of time. You still have to get the book. Hope is Christ. And he's been forgotten as he describes himself. And if he is not there as he describes himself, you have no cornerstone. Or your cornerstone is not square and true. And so what you build off it will be wrong and it will not hold. And so forgotten hope is to reintroduce, not to just those who, I've been saved, I don't need to read that, wrong. Unless you've got the 600 references that are in there memorized and you know how each one of them apply to your life both as an unbeliever and as a believer, then it probably wouldn't hurt you to read it. We need to understand Christ for who he is. We need to thoroughly understand the cornerstone and how to use it to build our foundation. And from that we build up, and then we can be good stewards. So think about it when you're starting to think about your time and your family and your food and your clothes and your church and your church activity. It's mine. I started that little study, or I started that class, or whatever modern day ritual you may have started. If you started it properly to disciple, great. I'm not knocking it, but it's not yours. If you think it is, you should give it to somebody else. So really take some time to start thinking about how much of what is God you have claimed ownership of. So that's about it. Subscribe so that you'll get caught up, and so that you'll always be notified, and so that we know when there's enough of a crowd that we can actually have a live chat about this. And we'll see you next week, probably for Grace Is.
Made from nothing in creation, you spoke the word and life came to be. But how you suffered in redemption, you bled and you died to set me free. You are all that I desire, so much more than I deserve. Amazing mystery, how you love me, grant me grace to love